The Institute of World Affairs at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee presents International Focus, a weekly discussion of the people and events behind today's global headlines. Support provided by Milwaukee Public Television and the UWM Center for International Education. Now here's your host, Doug Savage.
Welcome to International Focus. I'm Aneesh Aneesh, Interim Director of the Institute of World Affairs. The dramatic shifts in Egypt's political environment over the past 3 years have included the fall of longtime leader Hosni Mubarak during the so-called Arab Spring, the election and subsequent ouster of Muslim Brotherhood candidate Mohamed Morsi, and the election of Abdel Fattah El-Sisi, the former head of Egypt's armed forces. With the military leader once again firmly in charge, Egypt may look to have come full circle since Mubarak's fall in 2011. But changes beneath the surface continue to transform the nation. To help us understand the relationship between politics and society in El-Sisi's Egypt, we are joined by Carolyn Seymour-Jorn, Associate Professor of Comparative Literature at UWM, where she also serves as coordinator of Middle Eastern and North African Studies program. Carolyn, welcome back to International Focus.
Thanks, Aneesh. It's nice to be here.
So since you were here on the show more than a year ago, much has changed in Egypt.
That's right.
But a lot hasn't. So let's start with your kind of broad brush strokes about what has changed and what has continued in Egypt.
Yes. Well, essentially, as you said, the biggest change is the military coup that happened in 2013, which basically ousted the Muslim Brotherhood president, Morsi, and reinstalled military power. There was a brief interim president, Adli Mansour, but basically El-Sisi as general was in control in control under the armed forces, or with the armed forces. So now what we have essentially in May of this year, 2014, former General El-Sisi was elected as president. And he took office actually in June of this year. So we have an election that looked quite a bit like the elections that elected Mubarak in the past, with a very high approval rating or a very high voting for the person who became president, but with a great deal of suspicion about what this leader actually has in store for Egypt in terms of pursuing the democracy that protesters had worked so hard for.
So, and you talked about elections and the general gets elected. I also read somewhere about the international organization doing an opinion poll and finding somehow El-Sisi's popularity about at the same level as Morsi's. What do you think of that? Well,
I think there is a certain amount of confusion and concern among the Egyptian populace as to what they need in a leader right now. The Egyptian populace was very unhappy with the authoritarian rule of Mubarak, obviously. They tolerated a great deal for 30 years. They were very hopeful when he was overthrown, and there was such a strong movement toward democracy, not only in Egypt, but throughout the Arab world. They've also watched the Islamic State take a lot of power in Syria and Iraq, take control of oil fields, take control of the economy, and so on. They've watched the Islamic State murder civilians, so they're very anxious about the nature of fundamentalist Islamist politicians and their followers. El-Sisi was essentially brought in to replace Morsi, a Muslim Brotherhood and Islamic fundamentalist leader. So there would be many people who would be very much in support of him because he was opposing Islamic fundamentalist leadership, right? There are other people, of course, who are very suspicious about the development of a new fascism in Egypt, simply a continuation of the Mubarak policies and perhaps even a worsening of the authoritarian nature of rule.
So do you think we can describe Egypt as a kind of polarized society in some ways? Because if you were to run free and fair elections and bring back Freedom and Justice Party, Morsi's party,
Yes.
It's possible he'll defeat El-Sisi in a general election, or they might have a draw. In that kind of scenario, how do you think this stasis that seems to have emerged, political stasis, which is now military has taken over, to avoid that stasis or to quelch it with vigor? What does it say about Egyptian society at the moment?
Egyptian society, well, there is polarization, certainly. There is polarization between people who are generally referred to as liberals or progressives, who would like more secular control of the government, who want more rights for women, who also want to protect the rights of religious minorities in Egypt. And then the Islamic fundamentalists, the Muslim Brothers, and the Salafis and others who want to adopt, obviously, a more religious control over the government and a more conservative, a more socially conservative. However, the point is that even among Muslim Brotherhood, there's a range of attitudes and dispositions. There is or there was at least a young guard among the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt who were more likely to listen to some of the concerns and interests of Egypt's secular youth. If they had been allowed perhaps a little bit more voice in the Morsi government, who knows what would have happened. Certainly there are secularists in Egypt who understand the drive and the desire for Muslims to be able to practice and adhere to their faith in the way that they want to. So I think there are ways for the two sides to understand each other, but it's very difficult now when the state of Egypt faces Islamic insurgency in its own territory in the North Sinai, in the region that's bordering Gaza. People are very fearful that that insurgency is going to spread throughout the country.
So do you think the rise of insurgency and the rise of this particular group, Ansar Beit al-Maqdis, is directly connected with the problem of legitimacy for El-Sisi's Egypt, the legitimacy of his government? Is that the reason they are gaining more and more support within Egypt? Or is that something unconnected with the politics at the center?
Yeah, it's a complex question. Ansar is a group that already has connections with the Palestine-Israeli conflict. And this is, of course, a huge thorn in the side of any government right now in the region, and also, of course, the United States government's attempts to intervene. The Ansar are radical extremists operating in Egypt right now. They are radically opposed to what El-Sisi has done. They're critical of the Muslim Brotherhood for allowing themselves to be deposed even. Certainly, I suppose you could say that the fact that they have been able to establish themselves in North Sinai suggests that there are, at least in that region, and in pockets in Western Egypt as well, a number of people who support them over and above El-Sisi. But I don't think the vast majority of Egyptians by any means would support this organization, the Ansar.
Fascinating. But also, I think Ansar the group has pledged allegiance to ISIS.
Most recently, yes, they did.
Right? instead of Al-Qaeda, because earlier some of the more radical factions were attached with Al-Qaeda's group.
Yes, and yes, that's right. Ansar Beit al-Maqdis has pledged allegiance to al-Baghdadi, who's the head of the Islamic State, which I think they see ultimately the Islamic State as being more powerful and more influential than Al-Qaeda at this point. And again, Al-Qaeda has weakened greatly, partly because of the rise of the Islamic State. How long will the Islamic State be able to remain in its current ascendancy? Perhaps longer, because it does have control of oil, it does have control of land and economy. But I think the Egyptian people are very anxiously, kind of waiting, like the rest of us, to see if they're able to make further inroads into Egypt. One thing to keep in mind about Egypt is that the Sinai Peninsula has been a place in which Islamic fundamentalists, or radicals I should say, have operated in the past. It's been a place through which arms have been passed relatively easily. It's sometimes been hard to control. So the fact that they are there doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to be easily able to move into Alexandria and Cairo and other major cities.
And if you think the United States succeeds in its war against ISIS, will it affect the insurgency inside Egypt to some degree?
I think it would have to, because it appears anyway that arms are being passed through the tunnels in Gaza, perhaps between members of the Islamic State and Ansar Beit al-Maqdis. So, I mean, it would appear that that's what's happening anyway.
Very fascinating. What about other factions of society in this state? And after the break, we'll come back and talk about some of the role of the women in society and other things that you have researched about, the street art, etc. But how do you see the morale of the country at the moment?
Yes.
In Egypt?
Well, I can only, having not actually been in Cairo myself for about 2 years, I can only say that I know this through my own correspondences with my colleagues and friends in Egypt. I know that some of them are very anxious about the political situation, are kind of depressed because the Arab Spring in Egypt didn't bring exactly what they wanted. I also know, however, that they feel that they knew all along that what happened in January 2011 was just the beginning of a long road. And at some level, they expected that many people would die and that it would be a long road of revolution.
So how hopeful are you about the political life of Egypt?
Whenever I go back to Egypt, my hope always renews itself, partly because I see the Egyptian youth who seem to have this tremendous and undying energy and optimism, which is sometimes hard to understand given what the country has been through. But I do think that so many Egyptian youth are active, they're committed to trying to make a better future for their country, and they see the importance of democratization.
All right, so here we'll take a short break and we'll come back. Stay with us, please.
The Institute of World Affairs presents our community with a range of public programs relating to global issues, U.S. foreign policy, and the world economy. For more information about the Institute of World Affairs, call 414-229-3220 or visit our website at www.iwa.uwm.edu.
So we are talking with Carolyn Seymour-Jorn about El-Sisi's Egypt. So we were talking about the political life of Egypt. But let's go back to a little bit of political structure, because recently the constitution of Egypt was changed. Any thoughts on that?
Well, after the Constitution, the new Constitution passed in January 2014, many people were quite optimistic because it stated very clearly that Egypt should respect the historical position of religious minorities in the country, the Christians and the Jews, but I think particularly that's a reference to the fact that the Coptic Christians have a long and important history in the country and that they're a very important religious minority. Under the Morsi regime, the rights of Christians were severely restricted. There were, well, I should say, to preface this, that there's been a history of conflict between Islamic militants or Islamic radicals and Christians in the country, particularly in the southern part of the country. And sadly, during the Morsi regime, there were attacks on churches, Christian communities in Cairo and other cities. The new constitution certainly spoke to the importance of maintaining the rights of religious minorities and also allowing them to be governed by their own religious rules, which is actually a long-standing tradition within Islamic societies going back to the old Islamic empires. The Constitution also affirms the right of women. It affirms the right of women to work, to serve as representatives in Parliament, for example. It affirms the right of women to live in a culture in which they will be able to balance their family and their work responsibilities. It affirms the idea of political pluralism, of democracy as a current path and future for Egypt. So the Constitution itself, I think, has helped a lot of people to feel that, you know, if that Constitution is able to stay in place and be operationalized, things could be better for Egypt.
So in some ways you would suggest that the Constitution with which Morsi was working and changing himself in some way antithetical to kind of modern democracy?
Yes. Well, it was one of the reasons why women and why young people and Christians were so disillusioned with Morsi, because they saw their representation in government and their rights being restricted. And this, for many people, not just for women themselves, but for many people, that was not what the January 2011 revolution was about. Women and young people were all very active. Christians, Muslims, everybody were very active in that revolution, and they want to see rights for everybody.
So do you see some sort of urban-rural divide in Egypt in terms of women's rights and conservative values versus modern values?
Sure. I mean, there is an element of that. It's a little bit complex in the Middle East because in some ways rural women have had freedoms that urban women under strict Islamic rule did not have, simply because nobody was really policing them. They're working the fields. They can't work the fields veiled or restricted in too many ways. So in some ways it's sort of complex to make that comparison. I think that there were certainly people, there were many supporters of the Muslim Brotherhood in rural areas. Questions have been raised by political commentators about that. Is that because they genuinely believe in the rhetoric of the Brotherhood, or is that because the other liberal groups and coalitions weren't able to get out into the rural areas and educate people there about their own agendas?
So in some ways it comes down to the kind of institutional structure of Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt that allowed them to win a bigger vote than their opposition.
Absolutely. The Muslim Brotherhood has a very long history in Egypt. It's also been outlawed for much of its history, which the result of which was that it went underground. It created a very complex and efficient cell structure, so that it was able to operate even while it was being outlawed. In many ways, it was a hard organization for other groups to counter in the elections of right after the Arab Spring.
So what do you think of the women's participation in the Arab Spring, how widespread that was, how important that was to society?
It was very widespread and it was very important, both practically on the ground and symbolically. There was actually several occasions in which there were women's marches, specifically in which women rallied together. They were marching for increased democracy, but they were also marching against what they saw as the brutality, and this was, I should say, after Mubarak fell and during the period in which the Supreme Council of Armed Forces, or SCAF, was ruling. There were a number of brutal attacks upon women by the armed forces. Women protested this vociferously, marching in the streets in the thousands, carrying banners. Sometimes the banners were very cleverly created with symbols that everybody knew related to specific examples of women who had been brutalized, such as a woman who came to be called Sitt al-Banat, and others who stood up to military authority and really became heroines of the revolution.
So in some way the marches, women's marches, were against the existing government at the time. Were they also about women's rights in Egypt in some way?
Yes, and women, the issue of women's rights has been an important and long debated one in the country. Now women have had the right to vote, the right to work, the right to serve in parliament for decades, but you know, there are other rights that women are very concerned with, such as rights having to do with family law. Women feel in some cases that they don't have enough rights when it comes to divorce proceedings, that men tend to get the greater advantage in divorce and custody hearings and that type of thing. So these debates have been going on for some time. Many women would like to see legal structures put in place that would protect women more. Women would also like to see legal structures put in place that would protect women from sexual harassment, both physical and verbal, which unfortunately is fairly common on the street in Egypt and has been for some time.
So I suppose women were not marching for Morsi's Egypt, or were they?
No, they were not. Well, I should say that there are women who are strong advocates of the Muslim Brotherhood, and even branches of the Muslim Brotherhood that are devoted to women's groups or organizations. Were there specifically women's marches in favor of Morsi? I don't remember that. There are certainly women who were in favor of Morsi. But the women's marches that gained the most international attention were against the abuses of the SCAF, as I mentioned, but also were speaking more generally to state violence and arguing that they want a nation that does not commit violent acts against its own citizens. Unfortunately, the El-Sisi government has in many ways continued the authoritarian and brutal oppression of its citizens.
Oh, it's very interesting. So moving back to more of the cultural life of the streets of Cairo, where you have researched plenty. I remember that the street art was one of the major forces. The role of art and artists in the Arab Spring has not been as covered in the media. Any thoughts on that?
You mean the street art of the initial revolution of 2011?
That's right.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, I think that's probably true, and it may have been because of the uprisings that occurred before the uprisings in Egypt. Also involved a great deal of artistic innovation and graffiti marking and so on. There was coverage of street art in Morocco and Tunisia, for example. I don't know why it wouldn't have been as prominent in the media coverage of Egypt, but it was certainly very important in Egypt. Even when I went a year after the revolution in 2011, I saw elaborate, beautiful graffiti art, street art everywhere. particularly in places where young people could take a few hours to put up a mural, for example, or a montage without confronting security forces of any kind.
What do you think is going on in the minds of art and artists in Egypt right now at the moment?
Well, I think that certainly what I know from talking to my colleagues in Egypt over the internet or by looking at their posts on Facebook and other social media sites, artists are still working, writers are still writing and working. People are very interested in the use of the internet to post their art, no matter what kind of art that might be, whether it's writing, whether it's painting, sculpture, because people aren't necessarily coming out in the streets as much right now, because El-Sisi has really cracked down on public protest. So people are certainly still working. I don't think the spirit has been crushed at all. But because it's difficult for people to be out on the streets at the same level as they were before, I don't think you're seeing the same amount of street art.
Thank you so much, Carolyn. It has been a wonderful conversation, and we'll end with your thoughts on revolutionary art.
For information about the Institute of World Affairs and its many programs, or to become a member of the Institute, call 414-229-3220 or visit us at our website.